Okay, so here we are in the book of Daniel. Here's the upcoming schedule. So no Bible study next week. Hope everyone has a happy Thanksgiving. And then one more class for this delightful year of 2020. We'll do the Gospel of Mark. We'll take a Christmas break, and then we will start the new year from the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the Pentateuch. And that'll be fun for me, I think, because usually my Bible studies are on a delay, but I'm going to do my English and Spanish on those same days. So I've already done these classes. Actually, I think I've done the Pentateuch twice before. So I've got some basis of notes. I need to review them and revise them. But usually I am working up to the last minute to get my English one done, and I don't have time to then go through and do it and translate it. So I'm always on a delay. But I can start with doing the translations over the Christmas break and get to work on those and updating those talks. So it's a little bit crazy today because I've never tried to do 3 Bible studies in one day, but that's what I'm doing today. So I'm doing today Daniel, and then also I'm doing Jeremiah and Ezekiel in Spanish today. So that is a little crazy. And so hopefully none of them have suffered, but they will be good. But I wanted to get the prophets done before Christmas so that we can get a fresh start in January. And then, if I then try to revisit Jeremiah in February, I will have forgotten most of my notes. So better to do it while it's fresh. All right, so on to Daniel. So let's get some Daniel basics here. First of all, what kind of book is Daniel? Well, it's often clumped with the prophets. Like if we were to hear this at Mass, I think that the lector says a reading from the book of the prophet Daniel, but it might be just a reading from the book of Daniel. I don't remember actually. But he's got kind of a different sense. He's not really prophetic in the same way that Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah are. It's a bit of a different kind of animal. And yet it is somewhat prophetic because he uses some of these same kind of things, like having these visions of dreams and talking against the kings and those kind of things. So it's kind of prophetic, but it does kind of sit a little bit differently. It's not entirely historical. I mean, it's in the same sense of like the Book of Kings is clearly a book, a historical book, in the sense of ancient history. Again, I've talked about the difference between modern history and ancient history, but it does not exactly belong in the historical books, but kind of does. It's more than the writings, but it kind of fits with those too, especially in some pieces. It feels like something from like Tobit or Judith or whatever, so it kind of fits there too. It's kind of apocalyptic, talking about the full revelation and the coming of the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days and all these senses that we get in there, these grand visions and crazy visions of beasts and all that. So it's kind of in a little bit of a class of its own. It doesn't really belong. It's not as clearly organized. And as I was doing the research about Daniel, it has been put in different places organizationally in the Bible. Some have clumped it with the writing, some have clumped it with the prophets, some have put it at the end of the Bible as the last book of the Old Testament. So it just has gone in different places. So it's a little bit hard to categorize, but it's a little bit of all of that. It's prophetic, it's historical, it's writings, it's kind of a mixture. When was it written? Now, if you have your New American Bible, it will say that it was written in the, well, I'll just read from the introduction what it says. The work was composed during the bitter persecution carried on by Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the 2nd century, and was written to strengthen and comfort the Jewish people in their ordeal. And I think that's a possibility. The other book that I have been reading that I have really been enjoying, and I left it upstairs, otherwise I'd do visual aid again, but The Catholic Introduction to the Old Testament by Brant Petrie and somebody else. Brant Petrie's, as I've seen, his tendency is to kind of lean on the traditional historical method instead of the modern interpretation of when things were written and interpretation of the Bible. And so kind of a balance I find to be helpful. He's saying that it's basically taken for granted with modern scholarships, as it says here in the introduction of the New American Bible here. It was written in the 2nd century. Bam, no more discussion. But Brent Petrie kind of challenges that a little bit and says it's still up for discussion, but let's not forget what the early church fathers said, that they believed that this was written in the 6th century during the time of when Daniel would have actually been living. So I would say that, my personal take on that would be somewhere it's kind of both. I've used this before, but I'll use it again. I think I have anyway. I think there's a lot of tinkering. There's a lot of tinkering and editing that has gone on, especially through the Old Testament books as time has gone on. Perhaps our best example of a modern tinkerer is George Lucas, who did the Star Wars movies, right? So as you know, I'm a little bit of a Star Wars fan. Father Ashmore and I watched the newest Mandalorian last night. That was fun. But there are, if you look at the original Star Wars movie, which is now called A New Hope, some of you might remember that there was a special edition that came out in 1997. And then they further edited it in 2004, and then further edited it again in 2011, or further edited it again in the Blu-ray release or whatever. So here's a little example of this scene with Jabba the Hutt. It was originally shot in the original take from 1977 with this guy in a furry coat. That's Jabba the Hutt there. And that was the idea that was going to be Jabba. Well, everyone remembers Jabba, that big fat guy there, the blah, 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 blah. And so in 1977, they did the special edition, and they did computer animation, and they were able to plop in Jabba. Well, computer animation really had evolved even in those 7 years. They did another edition, and I think there's quite an evolution there from 1997 to 2004. It is really quite improved. But you look at that, and you're like, well, when was Star Wars made? Well, 1977. And like, wait a minute, I didn't realize computer animation was so advanced in 1977. Well, it wasn't. It was added to and adjusted, right? Or you look at the final scene from the third of the first movies called Return of the Jedi, right? So in the prequels, they cast this fellow as Anakin Skywalker, who became Darth Vader. And then they inserted his image, Hayden Christensen, in at the end of the movie. Well, now, if you're watching the movie and you're a little confused, you're like, wait a minute, how did they get that guy filmed? He was only like a kid. How did that happen? Wait a minute. Well, no, they added it later. So I would say that the book of Daniel and many books of the Old Testament, I think, are a good way. This is a good way to kind of think of it. You got the basis, and then it keeps on getting tinkered and edited. And so I think Daniel might be that case too, that there's lots of material that comes from the 6th century, whether that be told in just verbal form or if it was actually written down. And then it kind of got codified there in the 2nd century BC. So if it was in the 2nd century BC, it does make sense as well, because that is in the time of the Maccabees. And there's certainly some very overlapping themes between Daniel and Maccabees, and the refusal to bow down before the king and to follow the rules of the country in which they were exiled. It very much resonates with the Maccabean revolt as well, that they were not going to eat eat pork in Maccabees. In this case, they're not going to eat the bad food or whatever. So They're not going to bow down to the idols, all those things. So maybe a combination of both would be my suggestion for thinking of. I found this little slide on slideshare.net. I didn't know such a thing existed, but I was like, oh, they've done all the work for me. It's kind of ugly. It's kind of an ugly slide, so I don't want to take complete claim of it. It's all like, but come on, it's like it looks like it came out from like about 15 years ago, but it does have good information. But there are differences between the Protestant and the Catholic Bibles. And this is just a review. The Protestant Bibles have 39 and the Catholics have 46. And there are 7 books then that are different. They call them, our Protestant brothers and sisters call them the Apocrypha. We call them deuterocanonical. So Apocrypha means false writings. So we would not say that about the books that are considered inspired by the Holy Spirit. So we call them deuterocanonical, meaning the second canon. So 7 books, but then it talks about, and we talked about this in Esther, I presume, but there's always this little piece. Wait a minute. There's also additions to Daniel. Wait a minute. So which, are they just picking little verses and throwing them in at us? And what parts are in our Bibles and what parts aren't? Well, basically it's only this that stands apart, is the final 2 chapters of Daniel and chapter 3, verse 24 to 90. And I guess I must have known this at some point in time, but I forgot. But this is chapter 3, verse 24 to 90 is the song of praise of Daniel, of Daniel praising God after they had been saved from the flames, the fire. And so they have this long hymn of praise, and then especially from 52 or 55 and following, this is the passage that we pray all the time for feasts in the liturgy of the hours for morning prayer. And there's it's this constant kind of phrase that goes on. Angel of the Lord, bless the Lord, praise and exalt him before all forever. You heavens, bless the Lord. All you waters above the heavens, praise the Lord. All you hosts of the Lord, bless the Lord. Sun and moon, bless the Lord. Stars of heaven, bless the Lord. We pray that on what's the first Sunday of the 4-week cycle of the Psalter for morning prayer. And then anytime there's a feast, like Marian feast or Christ the King or whatever, we're going to pray that prayer of Daniel 3. I don't remember exactly where it begins, 55-ish. And we pray that prayer all the time. I've practically got it memorized. So I didn't realize, or I had forgotten, that our Protestant brothers and sisters don't even have that that thing there. So the appendix, which we'll get to, and chapter 3, verse 24 to 90, which is a key thing for anyone that prays the Liturgy of the Hours. Those are the parts that are not in the Protestant Bibles. Notice that I'm keeping my coffee far away from me. I'm drinking over here, and then I'm putting it over there. So where are we? We're in the Babylonian Empire during the exile. That's when the story of Daniel takes place. And then when are we? I've done this slide before, slightly modified here. So, and I messed up. I must have misread. I put Carchemish before, but it's Carchemish. And I realized this when I was trying to do my Spanish for Jeremiah. I'm like, why can I not find this town of this Battle of Carchemish? I heard that was a big deal. Well, it's because it's Carchemish. So I was like, this is not translating at all. So that was the fall of Assyria to Babylon in 605. Remember, we have these deportations. The first one is under King Jehoiakim. Some of the royal family is taken as hostages. 597, you got the second deportation. Nebuchadnezzar deports the upper and middle class, leaving the poor people behind. The idea is you kind of cut off the head and then everything else. Then they will fall into line because they've lost all their leadership. And then you got the third deportation under King Zedekiah. So all these people taken out of the Holy Land, brought into the exile. Then Nebuchadnezzar, they kept on revolting, they kept on stepping up, and Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, enough, and gets rid of everybody else and destroys the temple. Daniel is deported in the first deportation. So Ezekiel, that we had a couple weeks ago, he is taken out in the second deportation. Daniel is part of this royal family, along with those three others that we hear about. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We hear of those three. They are deported also at this time. So that's where we are historically. So then I try to keep a very basic structure, not going into great detail, but I try to keep the structure as basic as possible. So basically, we have chapters 1 through 6, which is Daniel and the kings. His various interactions with them. Chapters 7 through 12 are Daniel's visions. And you have chapters 13 through 14, which is the appendix. 1 through 6, Daniel and the kings, Daniel's vision, the appendix. Or perhaps another way to think of it is the famous parts, the weird parts, and Susanna and the dragon. Beauty and the Beast. So that's another way of possibly thinking of Daniel. The famous parts, most of the parts you've heard of, are in chapters 1 through 6. Then that weird stuff is chapter 7 through 12, and then the appendix and those stories. So let's go through, first of all, then let's kind of go through what do we got here in Daniel? What is happening? So again, first of all, in chapter 1, we hear about the people who were taken out of the exile. So we hear about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So those three companions come, and then they change their names to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they got Babylonian names. So they are trying to convert them to the Babylonian way of life, and you will be Star Wars and Star Trek today. You will be assimilated. You are going to be brought in, part of the Borg. You will lose all of your culture, bow down to the idols. That's kind of the main premise of Daniel is we are going to get this culture out of you, including your name. Maybe kind of similar to the stories that I've sometimes heard of people coming over to the United States of America, and they came through Ellis Island or whatever, and they couldn't pronounce their name, and my name is whatever, and it's like, yeah, nope, not going to work. You're going to be Smith or whatever, because your name is too hard and I don't want to learn it, and your name now is this. So I think it's not an entirely uncommon practice when you are coming into a new place. You have to understand the culture and bow down to it. And a lot of Daniel is about, well, yeah, okay, there are certain things that we can and certain things that we can't, and we've got to have that balance. So they are brought over here. And I'm going to skip chapter 2 for a moment because that's not part of the famous parts, but the first part that we have that's really famous from this book of Daniel is we have the story of the fiery furnace, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow down. They refuse to follow the idols there of and particularly the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar mandated. As we read in chapter 3, verse 8, it says, "O king, live forever. O king, you issued a decree that everyone who heard the sound of the trumpet, flute, lyre, harp, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all of the musical instruments should fall down and worship the golden statue. And whoever did not was to be cast into the white hot furnace." There are certain Jews whom you have made administrators, so they are running a lot of the administration there in Babylon. These three, they are not listening. They're not worshiping this golden statue that you have set up. And so Nebuchadnezzar gets into a wild rage and then questions them. How can you do this? You are so close to me. You are part of my administration, and yet you do not obey me, and you do not obey the mandate. And they say, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to bow down before the golden statue. So they get tossed into the fiery furnace. And it says there in chapter 19, verse 19, he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times more than usual, and then cast them into the white hot furnace. They were bound and cast with everything, huge fire, and yet they are not touched. It says that they walked around in the flames, singing to God and blessing the Lord. And then there were the three. That's when they have that big song that we sing in the Liturgy of the Hours all the time. And they praise God. And they have the three, and then they say they see a fourth man, and they say the fourth man looks like the Son of God. So this is a protection, maybe angel or an image of God or whatever, but someone has guarded them and protected them in the midst of this fire. They are taken out of the fire, and they don't even smell like smoke. I like that detail, right? So you go into a house of someone who smokes, and you like, I smell like smoke then afterwards, right? So not even that. There was no evidence even that they had even been in the flame. They come out completely untouched by the protection of God. And so then we have this new decree. Therefore, I decree for all the nations and peoples in every language, whoever blasphemes the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut to pieces and his house destroyed. For there is no other God who can rescue like this. So we have this great example of faith and faith in the midst of the flames. Now, the best version that I've ever seen of this, so that's chapter 3, sorry. If you have not seen the VeggieTales, Rack, Shack, and Benny, that is definitely worth a view. So if you can come up with a copy on VHS or DVD or whatever, Rack, Shack, and Benny, that is one of the best, I would say, VeggieTales episodes of all time. And it is, VeggieTales is it's amazing. I really admire them. We were talking about homilies and stuff, and what I try to have like a VeggieTales or a Sesame Street mentality when I do kids homilies, because what VeggieTales and Sesame Street are very good at doing is that they are good for kids, but they are also just as profound or work on another level for adults. So that's what I always try to do when I have a homily that's supposedly for kids. I try to make sure it's not just like just kids, but it's also got another layer on that is hopefully speaking to the adults there as well. So Rack, Shack, and Benny, and that it's called that because it's a funny introduction, because one of the characters, I think Larry, the cucumber, can't pronounce Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Rack, Shack, and Benny. Well, that's what we're just instead of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I can't say Abednego. I get stumbled up on that all the time. And they are called to worship the chocolate bunny. And whenever they hear this bunny song, the bunny, the bunny, the bunny, everyone's supposed to stop everything and worship the chocolate bunny. So it's very, very clever and a very great take on the story that we have from Daniel. All right. So that's famous part, the first famous part, the fiery furnace. The other one, another one takes place in chapter 5. This is where we have the famous phrase, I can see the writing on the wall. That's where this comes from. So I think it's interesting to study, where do phrases come from? Where do we even get that phrase? Well, this one, the writing on the wall, can you see the writing on the wall? Comes from Daniel, where King Belshazzar had this huge banquet for his followers. And then, as it says in chapter 5, verse 5, suddenly opposite the lampstand, the fingers of a human hand appeared, writing on the plaster of the king's palace. When he saw the wrist and the hand that wrote, his face blanched, his thoughts terrified him, and he shouted out for his enchanters. So he couldn't read what was written here. Now here it's written in Hebrew, which is, I think it's Hebrew. I presume that's Hebrew. So this is just, I think this is this Rembrandt. I can't remember who did this painting. So it could be in Hebrew. That's an interesting way of thinking of it, that they couldn't read Hebrew, but who could? Well, Daniel could. Or it could have been just written in the language of God, right? So, the words that are written there, as it says, Daniel is able to read them. He's brought in to this court. And the words are Mene, Tekel, and Perez. And it says in chapter 5, verse 25, Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and been found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And then that very same night, as it says, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So his days were numbered, and he's been found wanting, and his kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So he could not read the writing on the wall, but Daniel could, and then he passes away. Now here's a really deep cut. I'm getting kind of nerdy here. Well, getting. When I was a kid, I used to play this game called The Legend of Zelda. And in the dungeons, there were these hands that came along and grabbed your little character and took you back to the beginning of the temple. So or the beginning of the dungeon. So whenever I hear about this hand appearing, I don't know if you can see that, but there's those little purple things are little hands, and that they were just like this disformed hand, just whoop, and they grabbed you and then took you back. So you didn't want to get caught by the hand. But I always think of The Legend of Zelda when I hear about the writing on the wall with this hand appearing separately, the little thing there. So that's a deep cut, but for all you Zelda fans, there you go, all 0 of you. But that was a really big deal when I was in like 7th grade and that came out or whatever. It was all the rage. So still a very popular franchise, though. So the kids still play Zelda today. So and maybe not that version, but. And then the phrase thrown to the lions also comes from Daniel. This is probably the most famous of the book of Daniel. If you think of one thing from the book of Daniel, what do you think of? Oh, lion's den. Right? So now we have another king, King Darius. Darius the Mede. Now the studies say that there is no evidence of a King Darius in extra biblical sources, which is very odd because they would have kept record of that in the Babylonian things. They would have kept a record of the kings, but there's no record of King Darius the Mede. So as it says in my little commentary here in the little thing in the New American. Darius the Mede, unknown in profane history, that is, history outside the Bible. So it could be someone else. So Cyrus, or it could have been possibly modeled on Darius the Great. So this is one of the reasons, for instance, that some scholars say that it was not written in the 6th century, but was written in the 2nd century. This is one of the examples, is because the history is a little off and the names are a little bit off. So it's possible there could have been some, you look back and you get your details wrong. I mean, so if we were to write, let's see, if we were to write about, let's see here, we're in 2020, so something in like about 1620 or something, we might get some of the details wrong about what was happening and which king was that? And was he the crazy one, or was he the crazy one? Especially if we don't have access to the internet and all those kinds of things. So it's possible that that's one of the evidences of the book being written later. So, but anyway, there's this new king, Darius. It's not Nebuchadnezzar. It's not Belshazzar. It's Darius. And they were trying to find reason to get rid of Daniel. The other people in the administration, there was jealousy, and they wanted to have his position and everything, but they couldn't find anything that that he had done wrong. So they looked for ways to get rid of Daniel. And it says in chapter 6, verse 11, even after Daniel heard this law had been signed, he continued his custom of going home to kneel in prayer and give thanks to God. So they were not allowed to do that under this new law. And then they would not decree, O king, that no one is to address a petition to God or man for 30 days except to you, O king, otherwise shall be cast into the lions. And so Darius agrees. Yep, that's the law. So we need to toss Daniel into the lions. Now, he was tricked, King Darius. He didn't really want to do this because he liked Daniel, but he had written this law. Daniel broke it, so he needs to stick to it. As my little nephew used to say, what happens when you break a rule? Consequences. So there's consequences for the law that has been made. And so Daniel gets thrown to the lions. And I really like this painting. Again, I don't know who did this one, but he's just standing there, a bunch of lions, probably looking up, adoring, praying God. No problem. And so God saves him from the lions. And then again, it's very similar to the fiery furnace story, that now we have proof of God's deliverance and that God is the true God. This God of Daniel shall be worshipped for all. So those are the 3 major pieces, the most memorable parts from chapters 1 through 6. So you got the fiery furnace, the writing on the wall, and with him being thrown to the lions. Also in here is the story of Nebuchadnezzar that goes along with the story of Shalmaneser. And Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 had this dream and had this vision. It's not as well known here as these other major pieces here. But Daniel comes and interprets his dream, and he humbles himself, Nebuchadnezzar does. He humbles himself in the sight of God, and therefore is restored to his kingship. He goes a little bit crazy, and then he is restored to the fullness of the way that he was reigning and restored. This is really put in contrast to the story of Shalmaneser, who would not change, would not convert, who would not reform, and he dies. So that other piece that happens in this section is that story of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar really is this major figure that appears in many of these exile stories. He's like he's like an Abraham Lincoln, or he is like a Adolf Hitler, or he's like a Napoleon kind of figure who's kind of larger than life and sometimes gets even taken out of context. All right, here's another deep. I just thought of this, so I don't have a graphic for this, but I'll throw it in there. There's a movie, another deep cut, a movie called Time Bandits, which came out like 1982, and it's about this group of people who are traveling through time, and they go back to ancient Greece, and they go back to the time of Robin Hood, and they go to the time of Napoleon, and they go to the Titanic and all these things. I remember really liking that movie as a kid. And anyway, Napoleon is one of those characters in there. So he's like that kind of figure, Nebuchadnezzar. And so he appears in Daniel as well, because he's just this major figure. So I think there's 2 dawns now. That's a good trick. Oh, that's your background. Very good. So you got your background of yourself. That's lovely. Okay, so anyway, that's chapters 1 through 6. Nobody else can see that, just the 4 of us, I guess. But so chapters 1 through 6. All right, so now chapters 7 through 12, the weird parts or the visions of Daniel. These are less known, certainly less known than those major 3 stories there of the writing on the wall, the fiery furnace, and the lion's den. So I'm going to spend a little bit less time on this, but that's a crazy picture. But to summarize, there are many different explanations of these visions, but mostly they are regarding the worldly powers. Now, if you look at this picture there, the horns, as I understand it, the horns are a symbol of the reigns. And these visions that are being given are of the different kingdoms, the different kings, and the more horns, if you got a bunch of horns, it's a very powerful symbol of the kingship. So this does not resonate as well for us, but it does give some historical background of these beasts. It's about one kingdom is going to take over this other kingdom. There is this rising up. So one is for Medes, and one symbolizes Babylon, and one symbolizes Greece, and one symbolizes Rome. But there's some disagreement about which beast symbolizes which. Or these visions also could be about kind of the end of time, or they could be about kind of the time of Jesus and the coming of the Son of Man, who will be the great king over all. And as I was doing the research anyway, it's kind of good to hold all of these things in at the same time. I talked previously about, like in Isaiah, when we hear about the Emmanuel, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, or the young maiden shall be with child and bear a son. Well, does that refer to Jesus, or does it refer to Cyrus? Well, it's both. That's what we would say as Catholics. It had the kind of the first completion, or the first fulfillment, and then the ultimate fulfillment that happens in Jesus Christ. So Cyrus is the first fulfillment of the prophecy, and then Jesus is that complete fulfillment of the prophecy. I think we can say a kind of a similar thing with Daniel. These visions had a particular meaning at the time for Daniel and for the various kingdoms, but they can also be applied for us today. And the other vision that they have there is this idea of the that, especially in Gabriel in the 70 weeks, or the 70 years, Jeremiah received a vision that the exile would last for 70 years. And they're coming to the end of this at this time of the story. And this revelation, or this vision of Daniel, is it's going to be longer than 70 years. It's going to be actually 7 times 70 years, because of their iniquities, because of their sins that they have committed. So this gives the context of persevering even when things seem like they're going to be longer. I think we can also apply that to what we read in the New Testament, where it often sounds like Jesus is coming back and he'll be right back. He just, sometimes you're reading like the New Testament or in Paul's letters, it's like, well, Jesus ran to the store. He'll be back in a minute. So that's what it kind of sounds like. Jesus will be right back. Well, here we are 2,000 years later, and he's still not back. What's he doing? What's taking so long? So I think in a similar way, we have this kind of first idea that Jesus would be right back. But for whatever reason, God's time is different than our time. So our concept of how long it would take is much different. What is the time for God? Well, that's it's a blink of an eye for God, So what's the difference for God in as far as God's time? I think similarly, we can think of that in the exile, that they thought it was going to be 70 years, and that was what Jeremiah thought and Jeremiah heard. But this kind of new vision, new revelation, and with new information also, because they had been unfaithful to the covenant, the exile has been extended. So that's another vision that Daniel gets here in chapters 7 through 12. And then we get to these quite dramatic stories again in the appendix. Now, why are these part of the appendix? Well, part of this is, it's interesting, the literary history of Daniel. Some was written in Hebrew and some was written in Aramaic. And I think that these last two pieces, they only exist now in Greek. They don't have a Hebrew or Aramaic connection, which, if I recall, and I don't remember all the details of this, and I didn't research this exactly, but I think that was one of the methods that Martin Luther and companions in the Reformation used to deem whether a book of the Bible was to be included or not. Do we have a Hebrew, Aramaic, or particularly Hebrew? Do we have a Hebrew first text? Do we have this evidence that this was in the Hebrew original? Is it there or not? And those 7 books that are in the Deuterocanonical, they do not have, or they did not have at the time of Martin Luther, a text in Hebrew. And so Martin Luther used that as the defining piece of these books we do not accept because they do not have the original language of the Jewish people. We don't have any evidence of this. And so we're going to reject those books. I think, if I recall, the Dead Sea Scrolls has revealed that many of those, there are these Hebrew text pieces there. And so it really defends, why they're in the Bible in the first place, but also because the Holy Spirit told us they are. So these 2 stories do not exist in Hebrew, but they only exist in Greek of what we currently have. So we have the story of Susanna, and we have actually 2 stories, but they're usually put like this: Belle and the Dragon, which again, it's very cute with Beauty and the Beast again, right? Because that's her name, Belle. But they have 2 different stories. But the story of Susanna. So this is a tough story to read, I think. It's a long story. Now when did I do this? Dang. Well, okay. Ignore that picture for a moment over there. We don't need to see that picture. I was hoping that I got the things out of order, but I wanted to say, we hear this story in the 5th Monday, the 5th week of Lent on Monday. And I will not forget anytime soon hearing this when I was in seminary, the story of Susanna. And it seems like, I don't know if there was like, it is a long reading. And it seems like we were in some sort of rush or something was happening. And it's like, this is going to take a long time to read this. And I remember him reading this big, long story of Susanna. And it's it's worth a read, but this is, again, the Bible is not rated G. This is about two disgusting old men who find a young woman in the garden, and Susanna used to, as it says in chapter 13, verse 7, Susanna used to enter into her husband's garden for a walk. And when the old men saw her enter every day after for her walk, they began to lust after her. They suppressed their consciences. They would not even allow their eyes to look to heaven. They were both enamored with her and wanted their lustful desire. So this is not a G story. This is not something you sit down and read with your kids. Probably not. Although maybe in today's world, maybe it's good to warn people that there's really awful people out there. So these two men, when she was getting ready to bathe, it's just terrible. These two men, they're waiting for her in the bushes, and they jump and they jump at her and basically are forcing themselves upon her. And she says, "I am completely trapped." Then Susanna shrieks, yells, and that's heard. And so they come rushing in there. And then Susanna accuses these old men of, trying to make advances and trying to do these kinds of things. And so then they take it to the court and they listen to them. And of course, who do you think they believe? Do you think they believe the testimony of the woman or these elders of the people? They believe the elders of the people, of course. So it's the story that keeps going on, right? So it's a very important story, I think, and very relevant because, believe the victims. Here we have this great story of listen, because they are generally not lying. So what happens is Susanna is about to be condemned to death, or she is condemned to death, but then Daniel steps in. And I don't know why no one thought of this earlier, but he separated the two men and asked them to give testimony of exactly what happened. And they give conflicting testimony, particularly about which tree they found her under. Okay. And then because they give two testimonies, that is proof that they are lying. And as it says, and the whole assembly, so he gives them this proof. And then in verse 60, the whole assembly cried aloud. They rose up against the two elders, for by their own words, Daniel had convicted them of perjury. According to the law of Moses, they inflicted upon them the penalty that had been plotted upon their opposed on their neighbor, and they put them to death. And so the two older men are put to death, and Susanna is saved. So there is justice here for Susanna. So it's a very powerful story, I think, and quite relevant. And I'm certainly glad that we have this in our Bibles, because it is a great thing to revisit and say, again, my texts are in the wrong place, but it's kind of like part of the Me Too. It's one of those first Me Too movements, right? The hashtag Me Too, that Susanna also has been part of this. She has been at least attempted to take advantage of, and these two men were put to death. So I think it's a great story, especially for victims of any kind of abuse, that there can be justice, and Susanna gets that justice. So that is that story of Susanna. And then we have the story of Bel, who is possibly another way of talking about Baal, that god that is constantly this kind of rival god to the God of the universe. And now we're with King Cyrus the Persian, and it talks about the Babylonians. They had this idol they called Bel, and Cyrus is convinced that Bel is real because he keeps placing food out to the idol, and the food keeps on being consumed by the idol. And so here is evidence that Bel is real. He is a real God, because I have proof, because he is receiving the offerings that we place before him every night. Well, of course, Daniel doesn't believe that, because there is only one God. And so he does a little test, and they close all the doors. They lock all the doors to make sure no one else is messing with it. They put the food out, and lo and behold, the next day, the food is taken again, and it has disappeared. And so therefore, there must be proof that Bel is real. However, Daniel, sneaky Daniel, has put ashes down on the ground, and they discover footprints. And so someone was sneaking in at night to take the food and to feed their family with it. And because there was a secret entrance. And so again, Daniel cleverly discovers this plot, and Cyrus is saved from this worship of this idol Bel. And then we have the story of the dragon, or the serpent, where this is also interesting, because we hear from the prophet Habakkuk. He makes an appearance, as it says in chapter 14, verse 33. We hear about, in Judea, there was a prophet Habakkuk. And it says, and he mixed some bread in a bowl in the stew, and it boiled. And the angel of the Lord told him, take this lunch you have to Daniel in the lion's den in Babylon. So we hear about that. But with the dragon, there was also this dragon that the Babylonians were worshiping, this serpent. Okay. And so they are calling him God. And so it says, Daniel took some pitch, fat, and hair, and these he boiled together and made into cakes. He put them into the mouth of the dragon. So there's that picture there. Look, he's feeding that little dragon. I like this. This is that's an old painting. It's so cute. And he says, and then it burst. And so he shows that this dragon is not worth their worship, that he is easily foiled, and this is not the God that you are to worship. You are to worship instead the true God. So again, there's a lot of stories where Daniel in this book, he explains dreams. He really shows the importance of the true God over the false God. And so here's that things. So this is Monday of the week, 5th week of Lent. So those two little things should have been before we got into Bel and the Dragon. So Susanna is kind of part of that Me Too movement. Okay, so lessons from Daniel. Perhaps a little bit of a blessing that we had, that my coffee went over my computer, because we are looking at Daniel on this weekend of Christ the King. And so we are to remember on this feast that we are celebrating this weekend that God, Jesus, is the true King. To summarize, really, Daniel is over and over again, other idols or other worldly powers are placed as a challenge to the power of the one true God. And over again, Daniel proves that God is the true God. He alone is to be worshipped. So he really puts that first commandment. You could say that Daniel is really the first commandment put into story and prophetic form, that he alone is our God, alone him shall you worship. Even in exile, even when we're torn apart from God. The idea of humbling ourselves before our God, and that God gives us hope in the midst of difficulty and oppression. So in the midst of what's going on in Babylon at the time, God is still with them. God has not abandoned them, and God still is to be worshipped. that's a great message, I think, for us today as well. These are certainly difficult times, and God has not abandoned us. But neither also should we just blindly accept. We want to mostly be trusting individuals. But when it comes to a point of conflicting with our faith and our love of God and our love of neighbor, then we have to say, no, wait a minute here, you have overstepped. And like in a time of pandemic, I mean, that, don't misunderstand me. That's not saying, well, I don't care what the nation says, go to mass anyway and put yourself in danger. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that what I've said over and over again is our commandment to honor the Lord's Day has not been taken away. I don't care if there's a pandemic. You still have to honor the Lord's Day. You just don't have to do it by going to church right now, but you do still have to do it. And whatever that means for you on a Sunday, you got to do that. And so, and if you just say, well, I don't have to do that because my only way of observing the Lord's Day in the past was going to mass and spending an hour in church, and that's all I did. And now I can't do that. So now I can't do anything. That's not true. You can still adore, love, pray, even if you are locked in your house. And even if that's what you need to be doing at this time, you still need to be honoring the Lord's Day. So that's just one example. So if anyone tells you you don't have to stop following the Lord, stop praising God on Sundays, well, that's when you invoke Daniel and say, no, I will honor my God. I will pray. I will set this day apart, because that's what we are called to do. So that basically summarizes Daniel. And again, here is what's coming. In a couple of weeks, we will talk about the Gospel of Mark, and then we'll have a little break. So I will now stop the share. And I will now see if there's any questions. I will, oops, go to unmute, and then I'll go to mute, and then I'll go here and allow and continue. So if you have any questions, let me know. You can send those to me in the chat.
There we go. There we go. Yeah, I wrote that before you got to your summary, which took care of it, Father.
I see that. I hadn't got to that. I hadn't even seen that yet. So there you go, Holy Spirit. All right. So there is that. Let me check the Facebook. I don't know if there's any other questions here from the live folks. Hi, everyone on Facebook. Hope you're doing well. Hi, everyone on YouTube. Hope everyone is doing well. Any questions?
I had a question
Yes,
on the
please.
fiery furnace. Daniel wasn't one of the three, was he?
He was not.
Okay.
The Holy Spirit. It was the other three: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Okay.
But Daniel wasn't in the lion's den, so he got his share.
Yeah, he had his turn, just different.
Not by flames, but by fire, by lions.
I know we're only partially through doing all of the books in the Bible, but hopefully you'll consider doing more on the history of the church. I'm reading a book right now that is fiction, but it's set in the 1200s when there was such a problem going on between the church in Rome and the Orthodox churches elsewhere, and even the Orthodox churches were splitting into other areas, and the whole philosophy and theology of what everybody believed was kind of up in the air. And I would love to hear your perceptions on that, particularly the fact that we went through 4 or 5 priests in a row within like a 2-year period of time. I mean, I'm sorry, not priests, popes. It's a fascinating part of history, and although, like I say, it's fiction, the part that they have that has to do with the popes and the church appears to be true. And so sometime, if you ever want to, I'd love to hear your perceptions on the history of the church itself.
That is a really interesting challenge, Karen. I like that. I never really thought about that. I like that. So yeah, let me let me work on basically finishing up the Bible, and then I might look at that as or doing most of the Bible, and then that might be a next step. I really like that idea. I'd have to really dig in and do some research, but that would be good for me. So I don't know exactly how I'd organize that. I mean, I could do it like a century at a time, or I could do it kind of thematically, but I like that idea of kind of an introduction to the history of the church and going through these things. That's a really interesting idea, and I appreciate that.
Well, we're running into some of the same kinds of theological issues when we read the epistles of Paul, some of them at least, talking about these other prophets and people that are coming in that insist that you cannot be a Christian unless you're circumcised, and things like that. And so it went on apparently for a very, very long time in trying to tie down exactly what we do and do not believe. And your view of looking at the Bible answers a question I've had for years about the discrepancies within the Bible. I'd studied before on people that said every word in the Bible is true, and if you can't believe it, you don't have enough faith. I'm sure you've come across that. And this is another thing that I'm now beginning to question is the history of the church and how we arrived at a lot of these conclusions. And yeah, it's a huge topic, but I'm delighted to hear that you might take it on. Now, just don't get yourself transferred.
Okay. So let me think about that. I would venture to say that's not going to come anytime soon. I would think that the soonest I could do it, the earliest I could do it would be like in the summertime or next fall. But that could be like a good, like kind of fall study of, and I will not have completed the Bible at that point, but I will have done enough that if anyone missed any of them, like there's plenty of books for you to look at. And then I will switch to a different theme for those who, just for a different audience that are like, I'd rather know about the history of the church. And so that's a great challenge. And I really like that idea. So I like
it too. I think that'd be super interesting why we had married priests and now we don't have married priests and why that occurred. And, you tell people there was a lot of problems back when priests were married, and then that's why they decided not to do that, things like that. I think it'd be very interesting.
Sure.
Some of the rules we have today.
Yeah, they are questionable. We're told we should believe everything that the church teaches, but that's very difficult in quite a few areas. And maybe knowing more about the history of it, not necessarily answering the question of is it or is it not truly a really, really horrible sin to use birth control when you only have 3 or 4 kids? That kind of thing we don't expect you to get into. But just knowing the history of where a lot of these rules came from. Well, that one I use because it's a biggie, obviously.
I'll have to think about that and think of how I could organize that. But I could do it by, I know this might not sound immediately interesting, but using the framework, I'm trying to think of what would be the framework. I could do it organized by ecumenical council.
Yeah.
So
because they had one in that period of time. Of course, they did before that as well. But it's according to this book, which is a hidden mystery,
So I could look at like major councils of the church, like Nicaea. Let's talk about Nicaea. Let's talk about Lateran, and not getting so much into the ins and outs of the councils, but that would give a pretty good framework then of why did this council come about in the first place and what was the issues. So that could be interesting. Like why did we have a Council of Trent? What was going on? Then I could talk all about that Reformation issues with that. I could talk about the First Vatican Council and what was going on in that time. I could talk about the Second Vatican Council, what was going on at that time. That might be a way to kind of frame the discussion to give a kind of a focus point rather than, okay, let's just talk about history. But okay, boom. What was discussed and why was this discussed and why was this important?
I think that would be fascinating. And if you don't want to, you don't even have to get into the one that they had in the 50s, because that's pretty close to home for where you are now. And I don't think you want to go out publicly and get too into that. But whatever you want to do will be great. I just am very excited about the fact that you're interested. Thank you.
I am. Good idea.
Okay. And I'm going to let you go because it is time for you to almost start your other things today. So I know you need to
switch languages.
Very, very fascinating.
Good luck with that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Well, they've all left. Facebook, anybody left over there? Any other questions? Thanks, Marilyn. All right. Well, I guess that is Although we've come to the end of the study.